Good evening and welcome back to my channel. I am the Loyal Hufflepuff, and tonight we will continue our reading in Slaying the Giants in Your Life by David Jeremiah. This book came out roughly about the same time as Facing the Giants, the film by the Kendrick brothers, and we've been going over this the past 4 weeks, and we are now in chapter 5. I found out just recently that this is going to be a 12-part series, and we're going to be reading each part. So it's okay. We've got 8 more weeks of this. If not tonight, then it's 7 weeks of reading the book. So I hope you all have been enjoying the series, and I hope that you get to I hope you all have been enjoying your time listening to this book, to me reading the book. And I hope this book has been encouraging you guys this past few weeks. If it has been, please comment down below. I'd love to hear how this book has been encouraging to you all, as it has been for me. So without further ado, let us continue our reading in Slaying the Giants in Your Life. Robert Garth was running the race, chapter 5, by the way. Robert Garth was running the race, and he felt ready to break away from the pack. Not that he hadn't been slow off the starting blocks. Robert had been born into a poor family in Detroit. His house was small, and his clothes were shabby and shameful to him. But at age 15, Robert had found the key to help him escape his limitations. His young body was built for speed. He could run like the wind, and that gift had bought him a ticket to the Junior Olympic tryouts. If he ran well, then his dreams might come true, for him and for all his brothers and sisters. All the fastest sprinters in the region would be at these trials, but he thought of his stained shirt and torn jeans. Now at his defining moment, how could he walk in rags among the best and the brightest? It was the night before leaving for the Junior Olympic trials. Robert sat brooding before the television set, thinking about his gray life. Somehow his thoughts began to drift toward the warehouse, where he did a few odd jobs for cash. He began to think about Joseph Moseri, the man who paid him. Mr. Moseri always pulled a thick wad of bills from his back pocket when the job was done. He counted them out carefully as he peeled them off, one by one. It was always cash. The man was always alone. Those facts suggested certain possibilities, unpleasant possibilities that Robert couldn't stop thinking about. A picture began to form in Robert's mind. A picture of Mr. Moseri coming into the work the next morning. A picture of a shadowy figure lurking behind a door with a blunt object, of the figure knocking Mr. Moseri unconscious and sprinting out the door with the money, sprinting away with the remarkable speed of a track star. It was an ugly picture, but there was another one that pulled at him. This was a picture of himself at the trials wearing bright, stylish clothing fresh from the best store in the neighborhood. The next morning at 5 o'clock, Robert was on his way to the warehouse. He eased behind the door and waited. That's when events began to quickly play out. But they didn't play out in a way that was consistent with the pictures he'd seen in his mind. They didn't play out as well as they did on TV thrillers. They played out, instead, to disaster. Mr. Moseri strolled through the warehouse with a coffee pot in his hands. He was moving more slowly and cautiously because of his burden. Robert crept toward him from behind. At the last possible moment, his foot brushed some object on the floor and made a noise. Just enough noise to destroy Robert's life. Mr. Moseri quickly whirled around to see a young friend he knew well, one raising a blunt instrument above his head. Sadly, Mr. Moseri said, "Please, I'll give you whatever you want." Robert hadn't prepared himself for a face-to-face confrontation. This was all wrong, and he panicked. He swung the club furiously at Mr. Mosseri's head, knocking him to the floor. Then he knelt and thrust his hand into the unconscious man's pockets, pulled out $67, and hurried away. That afternoon, Robert was on his way to the Junior Olympics. He knew nothing of the ambulance that rushed Mr. Mosseri to the hospital, nor did he know Mr. Mosseri would die that night. The next day, he learned it all. That was the beginning of the nightmare. Robert Garth's performance was less than exceptional at the trials. He came in fourth in the 200-meter sprint, a race he'd been certain he could win. And just like that, the trials were over. It was time to go home. Back in Detroit, Robert tried to pick up his life where he'd left off. He'd always been pretty popular at school, but it was no good now. Nothing felt the same. There was always a secret that isolated him. He had to face it. He was an unrecognized murderer. His focus on the track was gone. His formerly good grades plummeted. From the awful chaos in his mind, there was no escape. With one exception. There was alcohol. Robert had been much of a drinker in the past, but now he drank as often and as heavily as he could, seeking the blessed oblivion that blocked out his memories, if only temporarily. Somehow he made it through high school. Maybe he could turn the corner. The awful incident was behind him, wasn't it? The important thing was to keep running, to put some miles between himself and the terrible event. In time, perhaps, he could forget. Marriage would help. Robert and his high school sweetheart announced their engagement and planned the wedding. The marriage lasted 3 years, producing a daughter and nothing else good. The union never had a chance at success, really. The young bride couldn't understand her husband's bleak, morbid moods. What had happened to the old Robert she had loved? Finally, Robert's wife filed divorce papers, packed up her belongings, took their daughter, and moved away. Robert had few options. He moved back home briefly, but it was only another dead end. He and his father couldn't get along, so he climbed even deeper into the bottle. He tried other things, moving to another city, moving home again, new jobs, new starts. The track star was running, always running, but there didn't seem to be a finish line, and certainly no trophies. Just a dark, endless track and a cup of sorrow. The bleak face that greeted him in the mirror had 30 years on it now. There was no trace left of the athletic 15-year-old. He often found himself wandering through the city streets like a crazy man, mumbling bitter words to himself. The murder, all those years ago, was still on the books, unsolved. No one suspected the identity of the assailant. Everyone had forgotten. Everyone except himself. On the right, and one night, walking among the alleys, it occurred to him that he was tired of the knowledge, or at least of knowing it alone. Perhaps he should end it all. Then there would be peace. There'd be no more knowing. But he couldn't do it. Deep inside, something directed him toward the other option, the one even more frightening than suicide. Instead of letting nobody know, it only seemed right to let everyone know. And just like that, Robert found that his feet had changed direction. They were leading him to, now he realized, toward police headquarters. Those feet, once so quick, took him slowly through the door and up to the desk. There, before the clerk, Robert cleared his throat and stated he'd like to confess to a 15-year-old murder. Guilt is a giant with interesting powers. This giant is the most invisible, but the heaviest one of all. There are people all around us who are being slowly crushed, slowly suffocated by the giant of guilt. It kills slowly but with excruciating pain. Think of Judas hanging from a tree, Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth, with blood on her hands that would never wash away. The expectant woman who aborts her child, and leaves with remorse for the rest of her life. There are so many stories I could tell, and you could add to the list, but I believe the most powerful one of all is found in the Bible. It plays out in the books of history and then moves through pain and resolution between two psalms. It's the psychodrama concerning a man named David. David had it all, every good thing life has to offer, and he knew it. For starters, he ruled the greatest nation in the world. He was not only God's anointed, but also the people's choice. Once he had been an obscure young shepherd. Now he was the most important man alive. He could sing beautifully and play musical instruments. He could dance artistically. He was a military hero and a conqueror of armies and antagonists of titanic structure. David had the heart of an artist, the soul of a priest, the mind of a philosopher, and the body of a warrior. Perhaps it was an embarrassment of riches, too much for any one man to be given. In any case, David had finally found an enemy he feared, midlife. He'd grown up in the fields where lions dwelt. He had come of age fleeing for his life, hiding in caves from a jealous king. Whole armies had pursued him. Now he had made it to the top. But he was bored and restless. He needed a new giant to conquer. Sadly, he found one that got the best of him. David found himself restless on the battle lines, where he was spending time with the troops. At home, he found he couldn't sleep and he took a stroll on the palace roof. It was there that a sight in the courtyard below caught his eye. There was a woman, strikingly beautiful one, bathing in the twilight. David couldn't take his eyes away. Afterward, he couldn't take his thoughts away. Instead, he sought her out. It all led, of course, to an act of adultery that quickly gave way, as always, to remorse. He sent the woman home and tried to move on, but the whole incident escalated into a nightmare when word came that Bathsheba was pregnant. Everyone knew that her husband was away at battle. They also knew who was home from that battle. David realized his moral authority as a godly king would quickly erode if the truth came out. What could he do? David settled on a solution that made a transgression into a tragedy. He sent for the husband of Bathsheba, a man called Uriah. David invited him to his quarters for dinner and wine, then sent him down to spend time with his wife. No matter what happened between the couple, this would create a window of opportunity that would erase any suspicion that Bathsheba's child was illegitimate. But David hadn't allowed for one contingency: the innocence and goodness of the husband. Uriah said, "King David, I would feel right about spending time with my wife tonight. After all, the other soldiers in my unit are in the trenches right now. Here I am eating at a fine table, drinking palace wine. It's not right for me to enjoy all these luxuries." And so he slept that night on the steps of the palace. David's plan had gone awry. He couldn't think of what else to do. Finally, he gave Uriah a note to carry to the general. The note decreed that Uriah should be sent to the very front lines, the bloodiest ground, then deserted by the troops and left to die. This would produce a pregnant widow who could be quickly married. After all the wine and the feast, David was sending Bathsheba's husband back to war carrying his own death warrant. Murder and intrigue had been added to adultery. David knew the gravity of his bloody deeds, and he was sentenced to the penalty of living with himself over the next year. In the meantime, we have two records of what transpired in his soul: Psalm 32 and Psalm 51. They should be read in reverse order. 51 shows the excruciating pain of his guilt, and 32 shows his resolution and renewal. Both Psalms give us an intriguing window into David's spiritual journey, and they reveal to us a legacy of silence, sorrow, and secrecy, the telltale marks of the guilty. The agony of guilt in Psalm 32. Silence. When the damage has been done and the guilt sets in, our first impulse is silence. Listen to this somewhat awful description. When I kept silent, my bones grew old, my groaning all the day long. Psalm 32, verse 3. What else is there in times of guilt but silence? We can't talk to people, even those closest to us. We can't talk to God. Psalm 66, chapter 66, verse 18 tells us that, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear. This was no small thing for David, a man who kept counsel with God constantly on every subject. Now a gulf of silence stretched between them. The man after God's own heart found himself exiled from it. Sometimes the silence can be deafening, can't it? The only sound was David's groaning, and he tells us that his very bones became old through this period. His soul was suffering, and his health began to follow suit, something you can always count on happening. Sorrow. No one is more eloquent than David on the dimensions of suffering. He writes, "For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was turned into the drought of summer." Psalm 32, verse 4. A great army stood at his beck and call. A palace and a kingdom obeyed his every whim, but his conscience could not be ruled. David was trapped inside his own guilt. Sorrow overcame him, sapping his life of all its considerable vitality. There was no reason to dance. There were no words to sing. The only poetry he had was the poetry of grief. Secrecy. As we've seen, guilt is a force of isolation. He couldn't talk to friends. He couldn't talk to God. He was worse than an adulterer. He was someone who would murder to avoid negative publicity. Only Bathsheba and Joab, his trusted advisor, knew the truth. The king spent a year living with an intolerable secret, the psychological exile from God and from people. David, by constitution, an open and transparent man, had to face agonies he had never before encountered. Finally, God reached into David's world to offer a way out. He provided something profoundly loving and terribly painful. He sent an accuser. This is the accusation of guilt from 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. The whole story is laid out for us in the book of 2 Samuel. It tells us that the voice of God came to a man named Nathan, who, for all intents and purposes, was David's pastor. He served as the palace prophet, and now Nathan was sent by God to confront sin and corruption at the highest political level. It was a frightening assignment, but it came with the territory. Nathan was bold, being a prophet, but this was a daunting task all the same. How does one confront a king? Nathan achieved his goal in a very clever way. He told David his own story by way of misdirection, changing the terms and settings. He related current events in the comfortable distance of a parable. 2 men lived in a city, he said, one rich and one poor. One had the finest flock in the kingdom, the other only one little ewe that was something of a family pet. The little lamb was a part of the family, eating from their hands and drinking from their cups. No more than a little lamb, but a beloved one in the life of a poor family. Meanwhile, the rich man was entertaining a visitor. Dinner time came around, and the host didn't want to make a withdrawal from the wealth of his own herd. Instead, he thought of the poor man, out there living in that little hut, the man with a single scrawny lamb. He took the man's pet by force and served it as dinner for his visitor. David, the king, sat back and listened with absorption, caught up in the story, for to him it was no more than a story. He never anticipated the twist in the punchline. He never equated wool with women, or misers with with monarchs. All David saw was an outrage into civility. He blurted out to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die." 2 Samuel 12, verse 5. Nathan, of course, knew that this was a compelling ruling from the king, who was sentencing himself to death. "David," said Nathan, no doubting, pointing a bony finger at the very face of the ruler, "you are the man." What a moment it must have been. As the truth came home to roost, it must have been a stake through the heart. It must have been a public humiliation, and it must have been, in some sense, a relief. Now the thing was out on the table. At least the furtiveness, the secrecy was over. The solitude of the secret was the worst part. Now there would be public repercussions, but David had come to a place where he could accept that. It was high time to set his house in order. The admission of guilt in Psalm 51. Psalm 51 is already one of the most absorbing passages in all of God's Word, but perhaps one of the most intriguing portions is the superscription, that little introduction that often accompanies a psalm. This particular one reads, "A psalm of David when Nathan the prophet went to him, after he had gone into Bathsheba." In other words, we have here the aftermath of Nathan's confrontation. David had been humiliated and confronted with the full gravity of his wickedness. What does a man say to God at such a moment? How does he handle the awful state in which he finds his soul? He accepts full responsibility for his sin. It all begins with owning up. Many of us are masters of shifting the blame. It's a natural human impulse, and scapegoats come cheap. But not David. If you browse through Psalm 51, you're going to find personal pronouns again and again. I, me, mine. In the passage below, which encompasses the first 3 verses of the psalm, I've indicated those words with italics. I'll read those to you guys. "Have mercy upon me, O God. Blow out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me." Psalm 51, verses 1 through 3. There's no mistaking who takes the rap, is there? It's refreshing to see. Today, it's easier to blame our subordinates, or the board of trustees, or the media, or stress, or society, or an unhappy childhood. Most of us don't herd sheep anymore, but we keep plenty of scapegoats on hand. Don't overlook the importance of this starting point. The journey of recovery starts here or nowhere. You've got to own up to what you've done. President Truman kept that famous plaque on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." David, the commander-in-chief himself, knew the significance of that philosophy. To push away guilt is to ensure, ironically enough, that it goes nowhere. You must embrace it to distance yourself from it. He acknowledges the sinfulness of sin. Another pet coping device we often use is to minimize the transgression. "Oh, it was no big deal," we say. Think of the rationalizations David might have used. "I was dealing with stress. I simply made a poor decision, but it was an isolated incident. It was a learning opportunity, really. The man was bound to die in battle anyway. I'm his commander, after all. The woman was beautiful, and the king is entitled to beautiful wives. A king must be a little ruthless to be successful in today's tribal environment." Most people would carefully choose words that mitigated the damage and toned down the rhetoric. David's vocabulary, however, isn't like that at all. He chooses 4 significant words to take the scope of his actions. The first is transgressions. The word is one of moral gravity. It means a revolt against the law. Lord, David is saying, I've rebelled against your laws. The second is iniquity, a word capturing the perversity of man's nature. The third is sin, a word needing no introduction. It means to miss the mark. The fourth is evil, which sums up the whole sordid mess, a vile thing worthy only of condemnation. Transgressions, iniquity, sin, evil. When you fail to live by God's standards, listen carefully to your language. Ask your spouse or your best friend to listen for you. Do you use words with the gravity of these four? Or do you use words like stress and circumstances and unavoidable? And this is how God made me. The concept of confession comes into play. Confession is all about naked honesty before God and before fellow Christians. It means describing our actions with the same words God uses, and no dissembling or distortion. Confession will not allow us to foolishly hide, as Adam and Eve did in the garden. It will force us to change from the inside out. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. These, O God, you will not despise. Psalm 57, verse 17. David knew what it meant for his actions to be despised by God. The act of confession was intensely painful and thoroughly liberating. It's helpful here to make a side trip to Psalm chapter 32. In verse 5, David looks back at his painful prayer of confession, and he makes this observation about it. I acknowledged my sin to you, and my iniquity I have not hid. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. David is describing a breakthrough moment, the moment in which we come clean, acknowledging the awful truth. Finally, we can say we have done something right. Finally, the doors open again to transgressions with our Heavenly Father. In 1973, Dr. Carl Menninger, a psychologist, wrote the book Whatever Became of Sin. But his prophetic title is truer now than it was nearly 30 years ago. The word is out of step with the times, isn't it? There are no sins, only poor decisions, personal decisions, Actions once forbidden are now the subjects of TV sitcoms. And if someone does happen to do something our culture can't accept, then it's shrugged away as a result of nature or nurture. In every era between the biblical world and this one, sin was despised. One might be so conscious of a serious sin that he agonized over losing his salvation. If those generations needed a better grasp of grace, in our time that needs a better sense of sin, its blackness, its filth, its ability to exile us from the presence of our loving Father. Sociologist James Davison Hunter observes that school teachers no longer say things like, "Stop it, please. You're disturbing the class." No, that would be too judgmental by current standards. If Johnny is involved in some destructive activity in the classroom, today's young teacher is more likely to say, "What are you doing? Why are you doing it? How does doing it make you feel?" We can only grimace when Hunter points out that the word sin has retreated mostly to dessert menus. Butterscotch binge and fudge madongo are sinful, according to the menus. And that's supposed to be a good thing. But when it comes to lying and adultery, we fudge, of course. We choose careful euphemisms for discussing our iniquities. I didn't lie, I presented a subject interpretation. Or, I ended the marriage so we could better fulfill our independent goals. By scrubbing the word sin out of the vocabulary of everyday life, we've actually deprived the people of the doorway to healing. There's no way to be made well unless we first acknowledge the reality of sin. Apart from this, your situation is hopeless. He addresses his confession to God. David then addresses the true victim. He writes, "Against you, you only, have I sinned, and done this evil in your sight." Psalm 51, verse 4. That prayer is very wise. After acknowledging the reality of sin, the second step is to turn our face toward God. All sin is an offense first and foremost against Him, even when there's a human victim. David knows painfully well how Bathsheba has been manipulated, used sexually, made a widow, and subsequently the bride of her husband's killer. David knows that Uriah has been deprived of his very life. Even Joab has been wronged, for he was forced to compromise his integrity by following the orders of his king. And we must also mention the little boy born to David and Bathsheba, who was yet another victim of David's ruthlessness. All of these have borne the brunt of David's sin. But confession must first be directed above. David recognized that at the root of every sin, from the prettiest offense to murder, is an insult to the God who created us and sustains us every moment of our lives. Before the sin claims any victims, it has already been an injury to the person of God, who set out laws to guide us. David therefore said to God, "Against you and you only I have sinned." At the deepest level, it's only God, and that's why, when it comes to forgiveness, it's also only God. No one else can redeem except Him. If you sin against me, I can forgive you personally, but I can't remove your guilt. I can't give you that deeper level of forgiveness, because I can't remove the offense against the Lord. Only He can do that. David acknowledged this sin. He addressed his confession to God. This is the answer to guilt found in Psalm 51, verses 2 through 12. The first step is removing the sin. Now David turns his attention to the issue of cleansing. "Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin." Psalm 51, verse 2. 5 verses later, he adds, "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow." Have you ever been out after a day's outdoor work in the summer heat, and you long for a bath or shower more than anything else? David feels that way inside. He knows the full extent of his filthiness, and he knows that only God can wash the filth deep within. "Blot out all my iniquities," he pleads in verse 9. Again and again he repeats this idea. This is more than lip service. This is genuine, remorseful petition. He speaks of his sin and God's forgiveness with the same depth of intensity. If moral degradation is unthinkable, then forgiveness is all the more blessed. David is humble, honest, and wholehearted. Sin is a stain to the soul, and the king uses the same Hebrew word for cleanse that might have been applied to the cleansing of a leper. Serious cleansing indeed. I'm a leper of the soul," he says of himself with relentless honesty. "Make me clean again." In verse 7, we find this word hyssop. An interesting Old Testament custom is worth relating here. Purity, as we know, was a crucial issue to the Jews. The law required that when a person came into contact with a corpse, he had to be ceremoniously cleansed with hyssop. David is thinking of Uriah. He has been dealing with in death, and he must be cleansed to satisfy the fullest demands of the law. Lord, he continues, blot out all my iniquities. Why blot? Most sins were handled in the manner of transactions. If you committed some offense, you could perform some kind of sacrifice to make atonement. But there were two sins with no remedy: adultery and murder. David had committed both of these, and they were written in God's great book in red letters. There was nothing David could do, no sacrifice to make, no atonement to seek. The accusing page was beyond his reach. All he could do was fall upon the mercy of God to blot out that red ink. Wipe it away completely, Lord. No priest, of course, could do that. Only God had the solvent then and now. Number 2, restoring the joy. Unfinished business of the soul takes its toll on our lives. David had not prior to now confronted the demons within him. He had not come to terms with them, and he had paid the price in misery for a year. For 12 months, the very vitality of his life had been seeping away. Now he comes to God and seeks him to do more than offer forgiveness. He asks God to restore his joy. In verses 8 and 12 he writes, Make me to hear joy and gladness, that the bones which you have broken may rejoice. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with your generous spirit. Notice, David doesn't ask for his salvation to be restored. That will come next. What he wants back is the joy of it, the liberation and freedom of living the redeemed life. We can't lose our salvation, but we can certainly lose some of the fringe benefits. Some of us do things that displease God, and we never face up to them. The time comes when we realize our lives are grim and joyless. When that happens, we need to check the backlog for unconfessed sin. Something is standing between God and us, and we need the joy of our salvation restored. The non-Christian, of course, would never know the difference. He or she has always lived without God. But the believer who backslides, as we used to say, is aware of something missing: the unique, boundless joy of walking in the Spirit. Next is renewing the fellowship. Do not cast me away from your presence, David writes in verse 11, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Imagine it. Cast away from the presence of God. This would be the description of a soul eternally lost, a soul cast away. David prays to avoid such a destiny. He pleads with God not to remove his Holy Spirit from him. The Bible tells us that on the day when David was crowned king, God removed his spirit from Saul and filled David instead. The new king was mindful of Saul's great sin and the ugly consequences. Saul had become a soul castaway, and God had finally set him adrift. You can imagine that these things are running through David's mind as he offers this prayer. Please, Lord, don't let me go the way of Saul. Don't set me adrift. Don't take your Holy Spirit from me. Next was refocusing on the future. Uphold me with your generous spirit in verse 12. David is asking God to bolster him in the future, to help him learn from his tragic mistakes. He never wants to go through this again. Having dealt thoroughly with the sin, brought it before God, experienced cleansing, and sought the restoration of joy. The time comes to look to the future. There's a beautiful spiritual principle known as a covenant. Covenants often follow times of forgiveness and restoration. We say, Lord, I can see the folly of my ways. You've saved me from myself. Now it's time for me to make a solemn promise that I'll be responsible for my actions. I'll never let this happen again. It's a time to put it into words. It's a time to write it on paper. It's a time to hold yourself accountable. But it's also a time to seek deeper strength from God. Uphold me, Lord. Let me depend so thoroughly on your guidance that such a failure will be unthinkable in the future. In Psalm 32, we see how David's thinking has changed. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. Verses 1 through 2. The word blessed is another word for happy. Happy is that man whose sin is forgiven. The truth here is so incredible, so revolutionary, that your life is bound to be changed forever. If you will only grasp it, no sin outweighs the forgiveness of God. If I were you, I'd read the sentence slowly, several times. I'd contemplate it carefully. Someone like myself, reading this book, might have committed a murder in the past. You could be reading or listening from a prison cell. Some of you have committed adultery. Many of you have damaged and betrayed those closest to you, just as David did. The only two things I know for certain about you are that you've sinned seriously and that God's mercy is even more powerful. It's a great boundless sea that will engulf the worst atrocities we can imagine. It doesn't matter what others may tell you or how they make you feel. It doesn't matter how you yourself feel about it. What matters is God's response. For he is the ultimate victory of every sin ever committed. And he sent his son to pay the price for each one of them. His message to you is, I no longer know your guilt. I don't want you to know it either. I want you to live in a new way with me, in a fellowship so rich that it will overflow and overcome your old sinful tendencies. When we read David's appalling story, we react as he did when he heard the sheep tale. We say, this is an outrage. The man must die. And then, like David, we realize with a shock that we're talking about ourselves. We too have multiplied our transgressions. We do well to face up to the full magnitude of our guilt, as David has, and embrace the full magnitude of his forgiveness. I learned that lesson in the school of experience. As a high school student, I worked for a hardware store in Cedarville, Ohio. Fred Lutenberger ran the store, a fine man and a tough taskmaster. He sent me to the attic to clean the oily metal shavings from pipe threading, and each night I came home filthy. The work wasn't fun. I felt I was getting the lowest assignments. One day, I was hard at work when a customer came in to make a purchase. No one was there to help him but me. As we made the $20 transaction, stuffing the bill into my pocket instead of the cash register, I returned to my labor. I was in a hurry to be finished. When I arrived home, I found the store's $20 still in my pocket. It hadn't been thefted on my part, just an honest mistake. And yet, I got to thinking, this was a lot of money for those times. I was a teenager without much, and here was this boss underpaying me for hard labor. Why he required overtime and didn't pay me for it? I was able to create in my mind a complex rationale for keeping the money. So I kept the money and went on about my life. The strangest thing happened. I didn't think about the money except in those times when I wanted to do something for God. And then the issue of the $20 always sprang into my mind. It weighed upon me. But the problem was that Any way I could think of to make restitution would embrace me, would embarrass me, as well as my father, who was the president of a local Christian college. Like David, I had entangled myself in a mess. My new rationale was that I was protecting my father from embarrassment by not returning the money. Time passed. I attended seminary and married. Soon we accepted our first ministerial calling in Hayden Heights, New Jersey, working with youth. One day I received an invitation to speak to the young people at a Bible club camp. So I set off alone for Upper Darby, Pennsylvania in my car. During that trip, the old incident of the $20 arose from the grave where I'd attempted to bury it. All the suppressed guilt came back, and I was overwhelmed with remorse. On a car trip alone, there's a lot of time to think and nowhere to hide. You can't turn the radio loud enough to drown out a conscience. I found myself computing the interest on $20 over the intervening years. Soon I pulled over in a small town and pulled $60 in traveling money from my pocket. I stuffed it all into an envelope and made out the address, without any note, to that old hardware store in Cedarville, an anonymous restitution. Now, I thought, I can have peace. I'd repaid the money. I'd even been on the generous side in estimating the interest. But there were things I hadn't done too. I hadn't confessed the sin. I hadn't asked for forgiveness. I hadn't moved through the steps that David laid out for us in these Psalms. I found that the blot on my hand hadn't washed away. More years passed, and I became a pastor in Fort Wayne, Indiana. One day, the hardware dealers came into town for a convention. So, I stood at the pulpit when the sanctuary door swung open, and in came Mr. and Mrs. Fred Luttenberger. It was as if Nathan himself were coming down the aisle of my church, pointing his bony finger right at me. The Luttenbergers found a seat on the third row. I can assure you I didn't do my best preaching that day. I couldn't help wanting the service to be over as soon as possible. After the sermon, there was a brief invitation. Then I came down and found the couple. "Come with me," I whispered, as I took each of them by the hand. I led the Littenbergers to my study and asked, "Do you ever remember receiving an envelope with $60 and no explanation?" Fred Luttenberger nodded and looked at his wife. "Yes, as a matter of fact, that was a strange thing." Then I lost my composure. I began to weep as I told them the whole story. I'd been carrying the burden for all these years. A little thing, a few dollars, is enough, over time, to bring about misery, even destroy a life. I had confessed everything and begged for the Luttenbergers' forgiveness. They quickly wrapped their arms around me and told me they loved me. They thanked me for doing the right thing, and I felt such joy that it's difficult to put it into words. I felt light enough to dance. An old, heavy weight had been lifted, and I was free. Blessed is he whose transgressions is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Psalm 32, verse 1. In a little cell in Detroit, Robert Garth, former track star and confessed murderer, marked time. He was at peace even as the detectives were in turmoil, racing around to check facts and pore over old files. Robert's shocking story did check out, of course. Every detail. Only one element made no sense to the detectives. Why would a murderer who'd committed a perfect crime come forward to implicate himself 15 years later? He pulled it off. No one had known. But someone had known, of course. The person who mattered most of all. Now that person was free, at least from the solitude of the secret. He was actually able to concentrate on the book that someone had handed him, a Bible. The section of the book that drew him irresistibly was the Book of Psalms. It was as if someone had been recording his thoughts over the years, an x-ray of his soul. This King David had wandered down the same dark alleys of guilt, the same boulevards of despair, but he had found a way out. Robert read about a God of forgiveness who could shoulder the heaviest, deadliest burden. He found the promise of true liberation. David was a murderer like himself, and God loved him nonetheless. It was too good to be true, but Robert knew in his heart it was true. He couldn't contain his joy, and finally his feelings overflowed in a great shout that echoed through the barred corridor. He'd have to be careful about that. They already thought he'd taken leave of his senses just for confessing. He didn't want to be moved to a psychiatric ward. The trial judge, seeing Robert's remarkable remorse, was lenient. This defendant was his own accuser. He might have escaped, but he had made a full confession and accepted the consequences. The sentence was a short one for a murder case. My time in prison, Robert would later say, was easy compared to the 15 years I lived with that crime in my mind. Nothing they could ever do to me, even incarcerating me for the rest of my life, could measure up to the imprisonment of my own guilt during the 15 years of hiding my sin. Guilt is a giant of terrible weight, but Robert finally brought down that giant with a shout of joy. For the first time in years, his feet felt light again, light enough to sprint all the way to the throne of the one who forgave him. Now he was truly ready to run the race and claim the prize. Let's you and I run beside him. Now, as we just finished this chapter, let me encourage you. This was a lot of heavy stuff, and like he said, guilt is the heaviest. If you ever read Pilgrim's Progress, sin is that burden that's on your back. And the heaviest part of that sin that you have, true, some of it may be light, but the reason why you did it and the guilt is what's weighing you down. That guilt sits on the bottom like a ton of bricks. It's very heavy. And sometimes you feel like Christian carrying that load on your back, that load of sin on your back. All that garbage, all that stuff that you think is important to you, that things that gives you joy. It's only temporary, but you feel it's important that you keep it on your back. And the reason why I keep saying this about confessions is, and why I say that's the hardest, is because of the guilt that's inside. Now, I accepted Christ when I was a child, but as I got older, I was given more and more responsibilities. If I ever made a mistake, sometimes I would feel that guilt and realize I need to get it out. I need to get it out of my system. Otherwise, it's going to stick to you and make you weigh yourself down and get you sick. And that's not something you want to do for the rest of your life. That's why every time I tell you guys in this video to confess your sins, and it's the hardest part, it's because there may be sin you've never confessed yet. There may be some sin that you yourself need to go to God to. I hope this was not only an encouragement, but also an inspiration for you. If you're not sure if you have Christ in your heart, and you're feeling that guilt, that you know in your heart that you need Christ in you, because He alone can fill that empty space that's in you. He's the one that will give you that joy that's inside your heart. This is what's missing. He's what's missing. He's that missing piece. He's like that donut that you get from the donut shop, if you guys enjoy donuts. Because if you ever get a glazed or original donut and there's a hole inside, sometimes people will put a filler in and make the donut hole. That little donut filler is what I call them. I think they're called donut holes or something. But anywho, that's what fills in that hole. Without Christ, all you get is an empty hole right here, right in that center. As people, not just Christians, but as people, we are imperfect. The only perfect person was Christ. The only perfect person was Christ. And he is the only way. He is that bridge where you can have that relationship with Christ. Be like Christian. Go up to Calvary. See the cross that Christ died on. And let go of your burden and give it to Christ. Let go of the load. Put your burden at the bottom of that cross and give it to God. Get whatever guilt you have in you that's built up inside you. Give it to Christ. Give him the load. Because that's the reason why he did it for you. Is because of your sin. It's because he loves you so much that he did not want to see you. He took your place on that cross. He's the one that chose to willfully, a man who did no wrong, willfully go on the cross for you, to die in your place, so that we could be with them in heaven. But you need to let go of that guilt that's inside you. If you're ready to let go of that guilt, if you're ready to let go of it, let go of the guilt and let God have it. Whatever is burdening you down, whatever guilt is holding you back, I encourage you right now to get this settled once and for all. If you don't have Christ in your heart and you are ready, 100% ready to have Christ in your heart, that feel that joy once more, to enjoy the happiness that you once had long ago, I encourage you to do this right now. You can repeat after me. You can do it at home. You can do it right now if you want. But for those that want to repeat after me, I encourage you that you need to be serious about this 100%. Don't say you did it and act like the world. You not only need to do it, but you need to act like you are seriously following what Christ wants you to do in his word. And if that's something you're interested in, would you go ahead and pray with me? Just bow your head and close your eyes. And just repeat after me. Dear Jesus, I know I'm a sinner. I have all this guilt that's weighed down, whatever that may be. You fill in that blank. Lord, I know I'm a sinner. I know I need you in my life. I am imperfect. I don't deserve the life. I don't deserve to be saved. I don't deserve to be forgiven. And I thank you for sending your son to die on that cross, to be that sacrifice, to save me from my sin, and for rising again so that way we have a hope and joy in heaven. Lord, I give you my burdens. I give you my guilt, whatever that may be. You may fill in the blank. Lord, I'm ready to let go. I'm ready to serve. I'm ready to serve you full-heartedly. And from this day forward, I choose to follow you. From this day forward. And I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. If you're a child of God, I would like to welcome you into the family of God. And I encourage you to find a church, attend that church, find a way to be a part of that church, be a member of that church, and serve that church to the best of your capacity. Whether it's taking out trash, whether it's singing in the choir, whatever the case may be, do it to God's glory. Talk to a pastor, and if you have any questions of the guilt that's inside you, I encourage you to talk to your pastor. Get counsel for that. Pastors are there to help you. They are the counselors. They are those that will give you the best possible advice. And I encourage you to go to a pastor and talk to them of your guilt. If you enjoyed this video, if this gave you encouragement, if this gave you inspiration to come to Christ, please comment down below. I want to hear from you guys. I want to hear how these videos have been encouraging to you, how these videos have been helping you in your life, whether it's in your spiritual walk with Christ or in your realization that you yourself needed this, that you needed to hear this. Please comment down below. As always, I am the Loyal Hufflepuff, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.